Hello and welcome to Topic 2, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be doing an American government refresher, and we're going to introduce you to public policy. So, what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, as I mentioned, we're going to start with an overview, sort of a refresher of American government. Since this is a class in public policy and about how public policy has impacted the issue of gender, it's really important that we understand how public policy is made. And to really understand that, you have to have a good understanding of sort of the foundations of how American government is set up and some of the processes associated with that. We're going to first just define some terms: government, politics, and public policy. And then we're going to look at some key features of American government. What are the three branches of American government, which I'm sure a lot of you know, but a little refresher doesn't hurt. And then also these two principles that are put in place in American government: separation of powers and checks and balances, to make sure that there is a smooth functioning of American government. And then we'll conclude the lecture by taking a look at why you should study public policy. What are some benefits from that? And so that's what we've got on the docket. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we're referring to government, what exactly are we referring to? Well, I teach American government, and I think some of you are in that class. And so we'll just go with the definition that is provided in We the People, the book that I use for American government. And it's, a really straightforward, but maybe needs a little bit of explanation, sort of definition of government. In that book, they define government as the institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. What I like about this definition is that it's really broad, right? That it doesn't a territory can be very big, like the United States or Russia. It could be very small, like a Native American tribe, right? And so government can be really expansive and large with lots of different institutions, but it can also be pretty simple and govern over a small group of people. What I also like about this is that it's not telling us anything about what type of government it is, right? It's just simply saying that any government is the kind of, an entity that has institutions and it has known procedures and it governs over people, right? So when you think about this definition, we don't know, are we talking about a democracy? Are we talking about like a monarchy or autocracy, like a rule of one? Are we talking about like an oligarchy where the few rule? We don't know. There are lots of different types of government, but as long as there are institutions and procedures to rule over people, that's what a government is. Now, if you want to learn more about different types of government, feel free to take my American government class. But for this class, and I think most of us know this, but again, it's a refresher, that America is obviously a democracy. That means that it's ruled by the people, but it's a certain kind of democracy. It's what is known as a constitutional democracy. And so on the one hand, that when we say that the United States is a democracy, what we're saying is that the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. In other words, that when decisions are made, it's really the people that give the ultimate authority for those decisions to be made. However, it's kind of an indirect form of democracy, or also known as sort of a representative democracy, or we're a republic. That means representative democracy. And so what that means is that in the United States, the people elect, where we get our say is in terms of who we elect to offices, governmental institutions like Congress, the presidency, and so forth. And then we elect those people, and then they make decisions for us. And if we don't like the job that they're doing, then we're not going to vote for them the next time, at least in theory, right? We are not, at least at the federal level, a direct democracy. A direct democracy is a democracy where the people actually directly make the decisions. Now, some states have forms of direct democracy. You might have known that a lot of states are legalizing marijuana, and a lot of the states that legalize marijuana have a form of direct democracy called an initiative. What that means is that you get enough signatures for the people that live in that state, and then you get a question on a ballot And then however the people vote on that question, then that's the action that government takes, right? So that's a direct democracy. At the national level, we don't have any sort of direct referendum where the people decide. We are a representative democracy. We elect people, they make decisions, and if we don't like the decisions that they make, then we kick them out of office. But we're also a constitutional democracy. And what that means is that we have a constitution, and we're going to be learning about the Constitution a little bit this semester, in particular as it relates to ensuring that people are treated equally in the eyes of the law. And so in a constitutional democracy, the power of the government is really limited. It's limited by the Constitution. And so the Constitution tells the government what types of power that it has, what it can do, what it can't do. It identifies the institutions and, to a certain degree, the procedures of government, okay? And so when we're looking at a democracy, rule of the people, it's also a type of government where that government is really constrained by this document that we turn to make sure that government can be kept in check. Another aspect of a constitutional democracy is that within those constitutions, and that's the case in the United States, in particular the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights, that the rights of the people are identified and they are protected. And so I teach a class on civil liberties next semester. It's a great class. And we spend a lot of time looking at your civil liberties. That is the personal freedoms that you have to speak, to exercise your religion, to be free from unwarranted search and seizure. Those are identified. And it's basically telling government, these are the things that you can't do. It places a limit on the power of the government. And so that's just something you should keep in mind, right? As we're learning about public policy, we are going to see that what government can do is constrained by the Constitution, and also that the Constitution sort of outlines the institutions and procedures, but also that people have a pretty big say in the types of public policy that is enacted. So the United States is a democracy. It is rule of the people. But you should be aware that when the United States was founded, there were very few, if any, countries that were rule of the people, that were democracies. And in fact, even today, you might think that the many governments throughout the world are democracies, but that's not true. Only about 43% of all countries are defined as being a form of democracy. So that more people live in non-democratic countries than in democratic countries. And our framers wanted to make sure that the United States, the founders and the framers wanted to make sure that the United States was a democracy. But they had to make a tough argument for it because, as it says there, there weren't a lot of democracies throughout the world, and it was actually democracy was seen as like sort of a worrisome and a potentially dangerous type of government, right? I mean, the whole question is do common people, do regular people really have the capacity to rule? When you think about a monarchy, which is a form of autocracy, rule of one, monarchs are raised from the get-go, right? It's a line, it's a heredity line, and they're trained to govern, right, to rule over others. Do people really have that capacity? Now we know that they do, right? Because there are many, obviously, successful democracies. But at the time, the framers were really worried that, that if you put a democracy in place, it could easily just become a dictatorship. Like you could get a person with a big personality, right, and was making promises to the people, and then they would elect them, and then they would do real harm to the country. And so, the people who created this country were really aware of some of the downsides or the things to be concerned about when it came to rule the people. People, are power hungry, they're self-interested, that, our human nature is that we're oftentimes governed with passion over reasons. And so if you put these people in control, are they going to make decisions that serves the group, or are they going to just make decisions that serve their own interests? Are they going to make decisions in terms of expanding the public good, or are they just going to reinforce their own power position? And obviously we still answer those questions today. And so, they thought giving people the chance to rule could really be harmful. but they had a solution to it, right? Or what they thought would be a solution to it. Basically, what the framers of the Constitution said is that, we know democracy can be harmful. We know that people are not always governed by reason, and they're oftentimes governed by self-interest. So what we need to do is we need to create an architecture of democracy that basically puts a brake on the abuse of power. Basically saying, sure, we're going to elect people that are going to be self-interested, that they're going to look out for their own interests. They are going to, be irrational. But we're going to actually create institutions and structures and procedures that make it difficult for people to actually exercise that kind of self-interest. We're going to put a lot of guardrails up to make sure that this democracy, this rule of the people stands and survives. And it has, at least to this point, right? But I'm hopeful that we're going to continue on. So let's take a look at that structure, some of those key features that are embedded in our Constitution that make sure that the government has an eye on all the public good, what is good for all Americans, and not just self-serving power grabbing by those who get elected. So one of the key structural features of American government that's designed to basically place a check on the abuse of power is the concept that is known as separation of powers. The framers who wrote the Constitution, that basically they said that we know that people are corrupt, and we know that some people, when elected, will try to abuse power, okay? And if we put all that power in the hands of a few, it's more likely to be abused, right? Because there's nobody basically checking the power of those who are in power. And so what they did is they separated that power out. They basically divided the governmental power into separate institutions, into separate groups. The thinking is that if you separate that power out and it takes all of those branches to work together to get anything done, that it's going to push people to not be just power hungry, looking out for their own self-interest, looking out for their own group, but it's going to push people to compromise, but it's also going to have a healthy competition between those separate groups, those separate institutions, so that when one institution is grabbing power away from the other institution, they'll say, no, back off. That's not the power of the presidency. That's the power of Congress, okay? And so let me just put these up here because, as you are learning about public policy and you're doing, looking at the history of what's in place, that you're going to be learning about what legislatures, what the executive branch does, and what the judiciary does as it relates to public policy. You're learning about that this week. And so, the three, the ways in which power is separated in the United States is it's separated. We have the legislature, which is the lawmaking branch. They make decisions for the nation. We have the executive branch that they execute those decisions. So once laws are passed, they put those into enactment, right? They implement those laws. And then you have the judiciary, the courts. And that there are always disputes that arise over the decisions that were made. Are those decisions constitutional? The way in which those decisions have been implemented, are those constitutional? And the judiciary will settle those disputes that arise over both the creation of law and the implementation of law. Now, what I have up here is for the federal government, okay? And you may be choosing a federal policy, right, for your public policy papers. Some, like the Family Medical Leave Act, right? That's federal law. It says you can, take leave for medical reasons without losing your job. Obviously, you don't get paid leave. But a lot of the policies we're going to be learning about are put forth by the state legislatures or at the state level. But it doesn't matter, right? I mean, states all have lawmaking branches, executive branches, and the judiciary. For the federal level, the U.S. Congress, which is comprised of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, They are the ones that are the lawmaking branches. The executive branch is has that implements or executes those decisions. That's comprised of the presidency. Okay, so the president of the United States is a part of the executive branch, but then there's this huge federal bureaucracy that is actually charged with putting those decisions into action, right? So, for example, with the Family Medical Leave Act, a lot of that is left to the Department of, in part the Department of Health and Human Services, but really the Department of Labor, because when you are on your job and you're asking for leave, right, then the federal bureaucracy, the Department of Labor and others will give employers and employees guidance on whether or not they can take that leave. And then the judiciary, which is comprised of the Supreme Court of the United States, 9 justices, and then we have lots of lower federal courts as well. But that organization is seen in Wisconsin, with our Wisconsin state legislature, with our governor, with the state level bureaucracies, and also the state courts as well. Okay, so separation of powers separates power, so that it's not condensed or consolidated into a few hands, but into different branches. It also works with human nature, because if you're a member of the legislature, you're not going to want members of the executive branch or the judiciary coming and pushing into your rightful powers. So it works with human nature to kind of keep a check on power. Another aspect of the structure of American government that does that and does this, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, a lot of this is refresher, is this concept of checks and balances, okay? So we do divide power into the 3 branches. However, no branch can get anything done for the most part. Most of the branches do not have unilateral power, but to get things done, they have to work with the other branches of government. And so checks and balances is this idea that each branch participates and influences the other branches, okay? And in that way, it places a check on power. So let me just give you a concrete example, okay? And so in the United States, the President of the United States will nominate somebody to serve on the Supreme Court. But the president can't do that unilaterally. That nominee has to go in front of the Senate, and the Senate basically grills that individual to see if they are fit for sitting on the highest court of the land. And so the Senate Judiciary Committee has hearings, and they weigh in on it, and they can vote no on a nominee. Doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen. And this is just a good example of the check on the power. If you didn't have that, presidents could put whoever that they wanted on the Supreme Court, right? But the Senate is supposed to act as a check. Another example is the obvious one of that the Congress passes laws, but the president can veto a law. So if Congress passes a really crappy bill, an unconstitutional bill, or something that the president sees as being harmful to the United States, they can override that with the veto. They can veto that bill, but then it can go back to the Congress with the 2/3 vote, and you can override that veto, the veto pen of the president. And so, it places a check on power. It's supposed to instill cooperation, although we don't see that a lot in American government these days. But it's like, if you want to get anything done, you kind of got to move to the center, right? It's not my way or the highway. If a president wants their nominee to be confirmed, then, that in theory, they're supposed to pick a more moderate justice. Now, we know that doesn't work out. We live in an incredibly polarized environment right now. But that's, the founders might actually be disappointed with how things are working out. So, the examples that I just gave, Congress passes a bill, president signs it into law, or it can be vetoed, and that veto can be overridden. That court reviews the constitutionality of law, which is a huge oversight, okay? And, Congress can even change the size of the court if they feel like the court is too partisan or too biased, right? Those are just a couple of examples of that cooperation that goes along in order to check power, but also to push the legislature to push the government towards cooperative decision making, and through that cooperative decision making, hopefully passing laws and implementing laws that best serve the most people in the United States, not just a small portion of the people. All right, so now let's talk about public policy and how public policy is defined in the excerpt from the Thomas Dye book that you're reading, Understanding Public Policy, that you're reading this week. So I absolutely love Thomas Dye's definition of public policy. He defines it as that public policy is whatever governments choose to do or not to do, right? Very straightforward, but it's really true. I mean, for one, it's government, so it's any kind of government: state, local, county, national, tribal, right? And it's just this idea that governments do things, and in doing things, they basically change the lives of people for good or for not as good. Or public policy is when you don't take action as well. And we'll see that throughout the course of the semester. I mean, one of the things we're going to learn this semester is that a lot of women's issues early on in the 18th and the early part of the 19th century, they were really not seen as like the purview of governments, right? So when it came to contraceptives and when it came to abortion, there weren't a whole bunch of laws on the books regarding those kinds of endeavors. Government took no action for the most part, and they sort of left that to the realm of women. But then, and so that's public policy, right? I mean, because government's choosing not to do something. But then as we're going to learn, in the mid parts of the 19th century, in the 1800s, government starts to do something, right? And they start, prohibiting the use of contraceptives and prohibiting abortion for the most part. And so, I mean, again, both of those are public policies. One, the government stays out, and the other, the government gets involved, right? And so I really like sort of the way that he defines them. Now, what governments do or don't do fall into broad categories, okay? One of the things that government does through its public policy, and I teach a criminal justice class as well, which some of you might be in. But one of the things when it comes to criminal justice is it's about regulating people's behavior. It's basically saying, like passing laws or policies that are telling people that if you engage in this behavior, then you're going to get in trouble. It's a crime. But also doing nothing. Hey, we didn't pass any public policy that go ahead and engage in that behavior, and nothing bad will happen to you. And a good example of that would be, two gender examples about regulating behavior is sexual assault, right? And abortion. And we're going to learn, this semester about sexual assault and what government did and did not do. For a long time, that sexual assault was really narrowly defined. It had to be penile vagina penetration with aggravated force. And if that didn't happen, right, then the person was not raped. Men could not rape, or husbands could not rape their wives, right? And obviously that's changed how that kind of behavior and how we define sexual assault has changed over time through public policy and regulating behaviors, telling people whether activities related to their reproductive health care, right? Abortion. That public policy, so it regulates behavior. Those are just two examples, sort of gender examples. Public policy organizes society. Public policy tells us who you can marry, okay? And so it used to be that marriage was defined as between only a man and a woman. That public policy has changed. Right now there's still limitations on who can get married. You can't marry, first cousins or, those sorts of activities. But also I've had students in the past write about how when it comes to marriage, that in some states, as long as you have parental consent, children can get married, right? All of those are examples of how society is organized, because we organize ourselves according to, sometimes in terms of a marriage and family, adoption as well. And government and public policy has a say in how those marriages and adoptions are organized within our society. Government public policy confers benefits. So WIC, Women, Infant, and Children, is a subsidy, a cash subsidy, or it's not really cash. I mean, you can use it to buy healthy foods if you are a pregnant woman or you have children. Badger Care, that's Medicaid, that is health insurance for those for pregnant women, and also for children to a certain degree, but that's like under the CHIPS program. The Affordable Care Act, which covers contraceptives, all of those are gender public policy issues that confer a benefit to people. And of course, public policy would not be complete without talking about the way in which government and through their public policy extract and distribute money. And so obviously the main way that money is extracted and distributed to confer benefits, right, is through taxation, right? But government also has policies regarding child support, alimony, and so those are some good examples of gender public policy. All right, so now we have a sense of what public policy is and how it's defined in different categories of public policy. The next thing we're going to talk about is how public policy making, it's a political process, okay? And as I always tell my students, you're like, hey, Professor Hankinson, why is there a vacuum there, right? It's because public policy is not made in a vacuum, okay? The public policy is a result of politics, okay? And politics, again, defined by my American Government book, is politics is really the struggle for power. I mean, that's what politics is. But maybe a more gentle way of putting it is that politics is the conflict over who's going to lead us, the structure of our government, and the policies that government produces or doesn't produce, right? And so in a democracy, particularly our kind of democracy, people, you vote, right? You listen to candidates, what kind of policies are they going to implement. If you agree with them, you campaign for them, you vote for them, you raise awareness because you want to win that struggle. You want the people that represent your values and your goals to be elected to Congress in order to, implement certain types of public policies. And so, there's other ways of getting involved in politics as well. Voting is one way, but protesting, raising consciousness about particular issues. And next lecture, we're going to talk about agenda setting, how we get certain problems on the agenda of those who can pass public policy. All of that is an example of politics. And so public policy is a reflection, it's a product of politics, it's a political process, but it also, that politics is oftentimes reflects the values of the society at that time, as well as the historical context, right? And so, you look at sort of policy as it relates to gender in the 19th century. Gender norms were really different at that time, right? The idea was that the woman's place was in the house. She was the hearth keeper, the family keeper, right? The gentler and fairer sex that needed protection, and that it was men who were stronger, went outside into the dirty realm of politics and business in order to provide for their family. Well, those gender norms have obviously changed, right? Not that there's not residual, of course there is, but those have changed, quite dramatically, into the 21st century. When gender norms change, right, where we move from women are in one sphere and men are in another sphere, and women are weaker and they need protection, and when the gender norms change to an eye on equality, that men and women are equal and have equal capacity, that gender is not as really doesn't define your abilities, then you have public policy that changes, right? So when it came to labor policies, when women were going into the workforce in the 19th century, they were protected, limited hours, could only work in certain kinds of jobs, could only work for so many hours. They even got a minimum wage because if you're working as a woman, right, at least as a white woman, I mean, the whole, stay at home is really sort of, a product of white privilege. Those kind of protective labor policies are reflected at that time. But now equal capacity, then we put a lot of emphasis on treating men and women equally, or in gender in general equally within the workforce. Okay, and who has social and political power changes, right? Women weren't allowed to vote. African American women weren't allowed to really vote until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Same with African American men, didn't have the true right to vote until then. And when people start getting social and political power, then they can start making change in terms of who they elect. Okay, and not, I mean, power in and of itself is not a good, right? I mean, you could say if you have power, you can do good things with it, you can do harmful things with it as well. But policy is a reflection of the changes within political and social power. So, in conclusion, that why bother studying public policy? Well, there's lots of reasons, and I'm just going to go over this really quickly because I spend time in commentary. Your textbook spends time on this as well. But you study public policy because you want to learn what government is doing. So it's important to study public policy so we have a good description of what public policy is in place. And if there's not public policy in place, we want to know why. We study public policy because we want to know the cause. Why does government do what it's doing, right? Why did it pass this policy? Why did it pass it in this way? Why was the Family Medical Leave Act, the FMLA, why did it protect your job, but it didn't protect your income, right? It didn't provide for paid leave. Studying public policy will help us answer that. And then also studying public policy is, does the policy work, right? What are the consequences of the policy? What are the impacts of the policy? Is it effectively addressing the problem that it was designed to address? If not, what do we need to do to change it? So there's lots of good reasons to study public policy. All right, that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we are going to get into the weeds of taking a look at the public policy process. And boy, is that going to be exciting. And we're going to be using Title IX, and we use that in the commentary too, to sort of bring the policy process to light. So woo, can't wait. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I will talk to you again soon.